My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day. Waiting for a long time. April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again.
Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. So now we have it, Liberation Day, according to President Donald Trump. The world has been waiting, and with some showmanship on the White House lawn, the president unveiled on a board the tariffs on goods entering the US from its main trading partners round the world. The reaction started immediately and is still sweeping round the world. This is not the act of a friend, said the Australian Prime Minister, although saying that Australia would not retaliate. Others will. We will fight and build the strongest economy in the G7, said Mark Carney of Canada, warning that retaliation is coming from that direction. So who are the winners and losers? Is the US itself a winner or loser? Is this the end of globalization and the growth that came with it? I'm delighted to be joined today by Jason Furman, who served as President Barack Obama's chair of the Council of Economic Advisers, his right-hand economist, if you like, and is now a professor at Harvard University's Kennedy School. We're also joined by two Chatham House experts, Dame DeAnne Julius and David Lubin, both of our Global Economy and Finance programme. Welcome to you all. Jason, may I start with you and the question of whether this will work for the US itself? President Trump set out all his arguments. It was quite a disciplined speech, I thought, at the beginning, till he went off-piste. But he set out his arguments that this is a way of remedying an unfairness in the tariffs that others charge US goods, that it will bring jobs in manufacturing back to the US, and that it will raise great revenue for the federal government. What do you make of this?
The last statement is correct. This does raise a lot of revenue for the federal government. It raises it in about as dumb a way as you could design. It's on a very narrow and distorted base, which requires a very high rate. That's exactly what you don't want to do in tax policy. The more fundamental goals, though, it's going to be counterproductive. Just about every forecaster has marked down their estimates for economic growth, marked up their estimates for inflation. And when it comes to manufacturing in particular, there are 5 aspects of this that will hurt manufacturing. First, manufacturing relies on intermediate inputs that are imported. Say you import steel and use it to make a car. That'll go up in price, make it harder for manufacturers. Second of all, over time, expect the dollar to be stronger as a result of it, although that may not be the market reaction on the very first day. That makes it harder for exports. Third, some countries will retaliate. That will also make it harder for our exports, which are primarily in manufacturing. Fourth, other countries will be poorer and they won't buy as much. And number 5, the United States will be poorer and it will be in less of a position to invest. So for all 5 of those reasons, I expect this to reduce manufacturing employment.
Why, and here we're taking a step into politics, not economics, but why do you think that that kind of riposte has not had much purchase so far on his team?
Well, you say his team. I mean, there's 1 or 2 people there that are very, very extreme and relatively unmoored from reality, so it hasn't had much of an effect on them. His main economic advisors, his Treasury Secretary, his NEC Director, his CEA Chair, all of them, as recently as a year ago, have either made negative comments about tariffs or talked about they're a great tool, but you have to use them really carefully and do this, 5-dimensional chess, super careful scheme to implement them. And none of the theories and rationales that his team previously put forward for tariffs is consistent even with what he did.
We know this is something that Donald Trump has wanted, believed in, and he does use the belief word, believed in for a long time. So perhaps let's leave that there. Here's something he's intended to do. Just going into the implications a bit more, if it does bring back some jobs, are those ones that the US really wants? Could it bring back lower wage manufacturing jobs but squeeze out some of the higher value tech jobs which the US has been so good at creating?
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest concern. Whenever you have tariffs, it's obviously a tax on imports. It also is a tax on exports. And it does that through the exchange rate, through retaliation from other countries. And so you get less imports, less exports. And that means you shift people who were in the tech sector or maybe building airplanes to doing things like making shoes and making clothing. I should also say a bunch of these tariffs are on things like coffee and bananas and mangoes and avocados. We don't make those very much in the United States. We're not going to make them very much in the United States. So for a whole bunch of this stuff, it's very, very poorly targeted. It's just a narrow tax on consumers, not any theory of restoring coffee production in the United States.
What about his unfairness point that the EU charges 10% on some things that the US charges 2.5% on in return? Is there any argument there?
No, it's utter nonsense. I mean, the EU on average charges tariffs about 1 or 2% on the United States. The United States on average charges tariffs of 1 or 2% on the EU. There's different things that are tariffed at different rates. So yes, you can pick examples in the EU of high rates on things like autos, but you can also pick examples of things at low rates like trucks. Now, the idea of getting those rates even lower and reducing the non-tariff barriers, I think is a terrific idea. When I was with President Obama, we were negotiating the transatlantic trade partnership that would have basically gotten those tariffs down to zero, eliminated those regulations. But then when one of the 28 EU countries left, those negotiations got a little bit more complicated and ended up withering on a vine under President Trump.
I want to bring in DeAnne and David here, just starting with this question of what this does to the US itself.
Well, I think the effects will be short-term and long-term. In the short term, there is an argument that the US will benefit because it will be a stimulus to US production and perhaps to inward investment by companies that used to produce overseas. But I think in the intermediate term, the U.S. will definitely not benefit. I mean, I certainly agree with what Jason is saying.
And the intermediate term is how long? What, 3-5 years?
Well, with financial markets being what they are these days, they anticipate things. So I think we're half into the intermediate term already if you look at what's happened to the stock market in the U.S.
Good to know. Day two.
Exactly. But I think that those secondary effects are really very important, particularly as this is an assault on the whole world. This is not just a bilateral tariff spat. This is really something that affects everybody.
I think the most important observation I can make to start is the way in which the tariff schedule that was announced in Annex 1 of the documents that were produced yesterday list 57 countries that will attract tariffs above 10%. The country that attracts the highest tariff is Lesotho. The tariff that will be charged on Lesotho's exports to the United States is 50%. Lesotho is a country with per capita GDP of $800. It has a total GDP of $2 billion. And yet it's, singled out. Why is Lesotho singled out to be the country with the highest tariff of the 57 countries? It's because of the formula that the USTR has developed to apply the tariffs. And the formula says that you take a country's trade surplus with the United States, you divide that by the country's exports to the United States, and then you divide that all by 2. So in the case of Lesotho, for example, its trade surplus is $230 million. Its exports to the US are about $230 million, and so that's 1. And divide that by 2, you get a 50% tariff. Now, the brutality of this kind of very arithmetic approach is only kind of softened for a number of countries. And I think the countries for whom it's been softened the most is Latin America.
I want to come on, and I don't mean to interrupt you, David, but I want to come on in a moment to other countries. But just on this point of the impact on the US itself, Jason was mentioning the inflation and the dollar, and you've been writing a lot about that. What is your view of that?
The reaction of the foreign exchange market this morning has been to weaken the dollar. I think that goes with the grain of the fact that consumer confidence in the United States is extremely low at the moment. There's a growing probability of the US tipping into recession. That would be dollar negative. And the effect of the Trump announcements yesterday is to kind of increase the probability of a slowdown in the United States. Forget about what you think about the rest of the world, and therefore the dollar weakens as a result of that. But as Jason was saying earlier, on the face of it, the arithmetic of tariffs is to suggest, indicates that the dollar will strengthen rather than weaken. And I think that, we need to be particularly kind of conscious of what happens in Beijing, the reaction function of the People's Bank of China. The tariff against China is absolutely enormous. The tariff announced yesterday is 34%, but on top of that, you have to add the 20% tariffs already announced since Trump came into office and the 10% that is left over from 2018. So the total tariff on Chinese exports to the United States is about 64%. There's no way that China can kind of respond to that, I think, other than to allow the renminbi to depreciate. But the People's Bank of China has made it clear late last year and the beginning of this year that it will be in control of the response of the renminbi of the renminbi's level to anything that the United States does. And so I think we will just have to wait and see what the Chinese exchange rate response is. But I think that the renminbi is more likely to weaken than strengthen in the aftermath of all of this.
Let's use that as the point then to turn and talk about other countries and the impact on it. China's been quite cautious so far. What do you think? How is it going to respond? How should it respond to this?
The United States, I think, would like to use this as an opening bid for negotiation. Scott Bessent said that if countries don't retaliate, this is the highest number that they will get. In other words, I think the implication is that if you give us something, then these tariff levels are negotiable. Sebastian Gorka, one of Trump's supporters, was on British TV last night suggesting the same thing, that this is all part of a negotiation. Interestingly, the use of tariffs as a negotiating tool runs against the idea that tariffs are a revenue-raising measure. I mean, if you're going to kind of negotiate the tariffs away, then they're not a reliable source of revenue. But I think in the case of China, given the fact that, the U.S. central foreign policy goal is to limit China's rise, to limit China's ability to challenge U.S. primacy, China's ability to respond through negotiation, I think, is relatively limited. And so the macro response from China is likely to be a combination of a weaker renminbi and additional stimulus to protect the Chinese economy from the effects of the tariff, because the effects of the tariff on the Chinese economy are pretty serious. Exports as a share of GDP in China is 20%. 13% of those exports go to the United States. That will fall pretty close to zero as a result of the tariffs. And so the implications for the Chinese economy are fairly serious, not to mention the implications for China that result from worldwide growth being lower as a result of this.
Let's spend a bit of time on this because there's a great range of possible reactions here, possible effects. Jason, where do you see this hitting hardest, and are there any winners you see coming out of this?
Yeah, so one really important point is I think it's mostly losers, but those losses really are asymmetric. And the United States economy matters much more to China than the Chinese economy matters to the United States, at least on the production and export side. And so this probably will be a bigger hit to Chinese GDP than US GDP. So the administration isn't wrong in thinking it has a certain amount of leverage here. Moreover, other countries are put in a bad spot because retaliation through higher tariffs hurts the United States, but it also hurts them. And in some cases, the modeling I've seen for Canada, for example, shows that Canada might end up getting hurt more economically because of the tariffs it puts on to retaliate against the United States than it did from the US ones. So you're doing things that are both asymmetric to other countries, the United States is, but also puts them in a place where it's difficult to respond. Now, they do have those domestic tools, doing fiscal stimulus and maybe in some cases like China, exchange rate policy. Where does this end? I mean, one question is, how long can the United States stick with this? Can we keep these tariffs for the next 4 years? Do they get overturned in a court? Does Congress retake the authority? Is there so much pressure from the business community, the president's supporters, and others? And in the face of all that pressure, I could see a scenario where small token concessions by countries around the world lead to dramatic reductions in these tariffs. But I could also see other countries responding and the United States going even higher than the announcement here. I mean, that's what uncertainty is just a really, really wide range of possibilities that could unfold over the coming months and years.
So the president could be holding up an entirely different blackboard of tariffs in not very long. DeAnne, do you think we're going to see a flood of Chinese goods heading to Europe? This was part of a discussion we had here earlier today.
I think there'll certainly be a lot of trade diversion because of the tariffs. And in fact, with China, it's an interesting case because Trump, of course, put tariffs on China and Biden kept them on for quite a while. And so China's been gradually building up its export market share to other countries. Even though its exports to the U.S. did come down and stabilize, Overall, China's exports went up because it has such strong relationships with Brazil and India and other places.
I was actually just watching a clip of the Brazil Parliament as I came down here, and they were hopeful that they might be able to gain from this.
Yeah, well, I think it will be differential for different countries, but I don't think China will be hurt as much as David was implying. I think that what China has done is really to prepare its arsenal for retaliation. It's increased the sanctions list, the anti-sanctions list that it has for companies. It knows that hurting Apple and Tesla and some of the tech companies, which do make a fair amount of their money in China, hurts politically as well as what the U.S. does to them. So I expect China to retaliate in quite a broad way. And we'll see whether Trump is really willing to increase yet further these very high tariffs that he has on China. I think in the long run, it's actually a very positive thing for China because it builds the suspicion against the U.S. as a stable trading partner all over the world. And I think the BRICS Plus grouping that China basically leads will become stronger because of this.
Yeah, that I totally agree with. I think, from a diplomatic point of view, this is a kind of a net gain for Beijing. I would argue, though, that China's ability to kind of capitalize on this diplomatic gain depends to some extent on China's willingness to open its own market to other countries' imports. One of the problems, I think, in the global economy is that you have a U.S. administration that has a trade deficit but wants to run a trade surplus, and you have an administration in Beijing that has a trade surplus and doesn't want to get rid of its trade surplus. So you have what I've called this sort of clash of mercantilisms. And if China wants to kind of make the most of its moment, make the most of the diplomatic gains that it has in the developing world, its fiscal response to this should be one that kind of promotes the Chinese economy's imports from other developing countries. The headline, I think, is it's very bad news for Asia and actually pretty good news for Latin America. It's very bad news for Asia, not only because of what's happened to China and the consequences for the rest of Asia of a sort of negative economic shock to China, but what are called the connector economies, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, all are attracting very high tariffs. The tariff on Vietnam is 46%, on Laos is 48%, on Cambodia it's 49%. These are some of the highest tariffs across the 57 countries. And that's what the Trump administration is trying to do, is precisely to squeeze that kind of tariff arbitrage that was existing after the tariffs were imposed in 2018, that, either manufacturing capacity was relocating from China to, say, Vietnam, so that Vietnam would be the base for exports to the United States and not China, or goods were rerouted through Vietnam. So one of the points of the reciprocal tariffs is to try and close down that tariff arbitrage. And so Asia gets it very bad because Asia was the main beneficiary of this trade diversion. What I think is interesting is the way in which Latin America got off relatively lightly. It's only Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Guyana in South America, forgetting about Mexico, that attract tariffs above 10%. Chile, Peru, Brazil, Colombia, and others, even countries with whom Donald Trump has bad relations, are all at 10%. I don't know, but I suspect this may have something to do with what I think of as Trump's effort to move towards an international order characterized by regional spheres of influence. It's what I've called the economics of the New Monroe Doctrine. And I think that his aim is to kind of dominate the region, which is why he's so obsessed with Canada and Panama and Greenland. And I think, his idea is that this economic entity, this regional entity, is bigger, stronger, more closed geographically and economically than any rival region. And so the rest of the world can do what it wants to do, and the US, padded by the Western Hemisphere, north and south of it, will do just fine.
Interesting idea. We, again, can't go into Trump's psychology, whether that is what he's thinking. Jason, would that make sense as a plan?
Closer relations with Latin America is a wonderful thing for the United States. I'm not sure that taking Greenland and Canada is quite as much to my taste. The one thing I'd be careful about is just because you get a low tariff, 10% being the lowest, first of all, that's enormously high compared to what those tariffs have been. They've generally been like 1 or 2%. So back in Trump's first term, 10% tariff against China was considered actually like quite high and quite a big geopolitical shift. And that's now the lowest thing here. The second thing is some countries will benefit from trade diversion that got low tariffs, but they'll also be hurt by the global reduction in demand that this will engender. So my best guess would be that Latin America will be hurt. They just won't be hurt as much as, say, Vietnam or Laos. So everything David was talking about is true in comparative terms. In absolute terms, though, I don't think this is good for Latin America.
No, I completely agree. I completely agree with that, Jason. I think that's right. But I also think that Donald Trump thinks in relative terms. I think that if global welfare went down, but welfare in the US went down by less than it went down everywhere else, that would be okay for Donald Trump, because the US in that situation would be relatively better off than anybody else.
Look, we're sitting in a country, some of us at the moment, UK, that has one of the lower tariffs, 10%. What do you think the effect would be?
I think it'll be negative. It can't be positive, really, in the short term. And not just negative for growth. We have a growth problem already, so it perhaps halves our chances of even getting a 1% growth this year. But also it's negative for inflation, which is a problem here and not just here. I think that's going to be a real problem in the U.S. as well. It'll push up inflation. And we do have a situation where government budgets are pretty stretched already, so there's not a lot of scope for compensating the industries that are most affected by this. But I think, again, talking in relative terms, I think Germany is probably the country that's hardest hit amongst the major economies. Their trade dependence, if you add imports and exports, is about 90%. Ours is about 35%. So they have been very successful as an export-oriented economy, but the flip side of that is that their exports, particularly to the U.S., are going to be hit.
And this is going to strengthen their arguments to get even closer to China. They've been slightly on the losing side of that within the European Union, but it will strengthen their case, I think. Jason, just back into the politics of this. What effect do you think, if inflation does indeed start going up, if growth in the US starts slowing, surely this begins to weigh right now on the minds of members of Congress, some of whom are facing their next election in less than 2 years?
Yeah, so there was a vote in the Senate, and 4 Republicans joined with the Democrats in expressing their displeasure with the tariffs so far on Canada. A lot of that was based on senators that have a pretty free trade orientation, or maybe were in a state that was particularly hurt by Canada's retaliation. It seemed less of a response to a mass movement and response to prices. And that makes sense because we haven't yet seen very much in the way of price increases as a result of these tariffs. But when we look at the April, May, and June data, you're going to see it. I was watching a clip from Fox News about a month ago, and they went to an auto dealer. And at the auto dealer, they were talking about raising the prices on cars and trucks. And, there was no economics in it. There were no derivatives. There was no fancy math. It was just sort of man on the street. Hey, here's what you're going to pay more for a car or for a truck. And politically, that's going to be very difficult in a country where people are still, like they are in countries around the world, mad that the price level hasn't come back down to where it was prior to COVID, something that, of course, won't happen. So politically, I expect that we will see a growing backlash against this. Will it be enough to get Congress to retake the power of the purse and the power to set tariffs? I'm not sure.
As we're coming towards the end of this, let's just take a step back and deal with our third question, what this means for globalization, which we have been coasting on and which has brought such prosperity to the world for decades, bringing hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. David, what is your view?
Globalization's been under a bit of strain for a number of years. I mean, it's been the last 10 or 12 years in which, broadly speaking, the growth rate of global trade volumes has been below the growth rate of global GDP. It's the first sort of 10-year period where that's been true since the Second World War, on average. And so this is a kind of an attack on a regime, globalization, that's already quite fragile. And I think, in a way, in order to revive global trade growth, you have to find some way of escaping this clash of mercantilisms. The United States has made it clear it wants to run a trade surplus. What I think is needed now to kind of support globalization, to support the trade growth, is A, for China to adopt a more loose view about its own trade surplus, and also for the process of additional fiscal spending, additional defense spending in the European Union to reduce the Eurozone, the EU's trade surplus as well. If that can happen, then you can imagine a reorientation of global trade away from the United States. But it's tough to expect that confidently, A, because I suspect the Chinese will be extremely reluctant to say goodbye to their trade surplus, and because the United States has kind of put a lot of spanners in the works.
Well, I think we have seen the end of the trend, that's for sure. I think things could be even worse than we suspect. I mean, it does seem to me we need to consider a scenario, at least, where not only does global trade shrink, but global financial flows will shrink as well, because, of course, when the U.S. runs a big trade deficit, which it has, then it runs a big capital surplus, and the other countries need those dollars. They get the dollars and they route them through their banking system. And part of globalization has been driven by the globalization of financial flows and the increased leverage in the world economy. That's all going to shrink. And that often has a multiplicative effect on the real economy. So I think we are in a stage, in a very turbulent stage, where not only is the global trade pattern reworking itself, but also global financial flows are going to be very turbulent and probably negative.
I might be overly rosy here and have an overly optimistic Whig theory of history. I think it's possible that American people, who up until now sort of thought that we could be an autarky and make everything ourselves, which is not a delusion that many or any other countries have, but I think it's sort of at the root a view that Americans have. That view helped bring us to the point where something like this is possible, and we're about to discover that it is extremely unpleasant and expensive and bad to move yourself in the direction of autarky. And I think it is possible that something that comes out of this is a greater appreciation on the part of American people of those enormous benefits that globalization has brought and the advantages of specializing and importing the things you don't make. Now, on what time scale does that happen? I'm not entirely sure. There'll be a lot of unpleasantness on the road to it. But part of what lies at the heart of that view is a sense that the gains from globalization are large enough that they're hard to completely do away with. You can absolutely stop the growth of it. You can whittle away a bit of it. But people have been talking about the end of globalization for decades now. And the reason that it's been more like a dandelion that can survive in any environment than an orchid that needs exactly the right amount of water and sun and the like, is that those gains are large enough that it finds ways, whether it's trade diversion, or foreign direct investment, making something in another country to sell there, or this ending in free trade agreements with some countries and the like. So this isn't how I would get there, but my hope is that people take the right lesson from this experience.
What I suspect might come next is more action on the part of the US administration to undermine the reserve currency status of the US dollar. Also in the pursuit of weakening the US dollar in an effort to turn the trade deficit into a surplus.
Keep American exports going.
Yeah, because the administration, I think there's some people in the administration, certainly the vice president, believes that the dollar's reserve currency status is a form of Dutch disease. In other words, it kind of leaves the dollar structurally overvalued because the rest of the world has all this demand for dollar assets. And that structural overvaluation has been one of the factors that's hollowed out US manufacturing. So destroying or eroding the reserve currency status of the dollar may be something that we'll see more of, and I suspect that also has quite a negative effect on globalization.
Do you know, David, I'm going to offer you and us and our listeners a whole podcast on the dollar, I think, because it is so interesting, but we're going to have to stop right there on that with a mixture of the dandelion and the dollar at the end of it. All three of you, thank you very, very much indeed, and thank you everyone for listening. Do join us next time as we continue to look into the big ideas shaping international relations and the mere events shaping those relations. Do leave us a review. I always enjoy reading them, whatever you say. Our producer this week was Amanda Nunn. I'm Bronwen Maddox. See you soon.